the mechanic, living a simple life, a millionaire woman, trapped in a lonely world. And one snowy night, their paths crossed. Nate, a small-town mechanic just trying to make ends meet. Eleanor, a woman who seems to have it all, except someone to share it with. On a cold winter night, Nate's decision to help a stranger in need sets off a chain of events that will change both their lives forever. That night wasn't just about fixing a car. It was the start of something extraordinary. Eleanor is drawn to Nate's quiet kindness, while Nate realizes something undeniable. Meeting Eleanor was fate. Two different worlds, brought together by love. But loneliness, fears, and the weight of the past threaten to pull them apart. Can the bond they've discovered withstand the challenges ahead? A love story that begins under the falling snow. Hi everyone, welcome to Emotional Lines. Today, I'm thrilled to bring you a brand new story, one that's full of heart, connection, and unexpected twists. So, grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's dive into this tale together. I promise it's one you won't forget. On the cold evening of Christmas Eve, Nate sat in the dim light of his small repair shop. In front of him were stacks of bills and an old calculator that didn't fit in the palm of his hand. The click of the keys defied the silence of the snow falling rapidly outside. Nate took a deep breath and set the pen down on the table. An uneasiness gnawed at him. He couldn't pay the bills, nor could he suppress the boredom inside. He was startled when his phone suddenly rang. The text "Mom" that appeared on the screen brought a twinge of happiness. He answered the call and heard his mother's soft but impatient voice. "Nate, are you still at the store? When are you leaving? We're all waiting for you. You shouldn't be alone on Christmas Eve." Nate replied, trying to put a note of joy in his voice. "I'm leaving soon, Mom. I promise I'll be as fast as I can, it's just a little backlog." After hanging up the phone, he grabbed his coat and grabbed the keys to his truck off the table. By the time he left the garage, the snow was thick. As his truck started to warm up, the view of the snow outside gave him a brief moment of peace. But this peace was interrupted by bright lights that caught his attention as he drove down the road. A car stood on the side of the road, its lights flashing in the snow. Nate pulled his truck over and stepped out onto the snowy road without turning off the engine. As the cold bit into his bones, he remembered to pull his gloves out of his pocket. As he approached the car and tapped on the window, he realized there was a young woman inside. When she saw Nate, the worry in her eyes gave way to relief. She opened the window and a warm voice came from inside. "Hello. Oh, someone's finally here. My car broke down and my phone isn't working." The woman immediately opened the door and got out. The snow-covered skirts of her long coat touched the ground. "My name is Eleanor," she said, holding out her hand. Nate nodded, hiding his hands in his jacket pockets. "These roads are a little rough for a luxury car," he muttered. Eleanor sounded slightly embarrassed as she explained, "I had to rush downtown this morning. I don't normally go out in weather like this, but it took me a while to get back. And now I'm stranded and I really don't know what to do." Just then Nate's phone rang. He took his hands out of his pockets and looked at the screen and saw that it was his mother calling again. He picked up the phone and, stepping away from Eleanor, began to speak. "Mom, I'm stranded. I found someone. A woman. I can't leave her here and the weather's too bad." His mother was silent for a few seconds, then reproached him slightly. "Nate, it's Christmas Eve. But I know what you'll do, you've always been like this. Just be careful." When Nate turned to Eleanor, he had made a decision. But he didn't yet know who this woman was or how this night in the snow would unfold. Nate looked carefully at Eleanor's car and made a decision. He put his hands in his coat pockets and spoke with a slight smile. "Look, I have a garage. Let's not keep you waiting here. You won't be cold there and I'll come back with my tools and try to fix your car." Eleanor was both surprised and touched by this generous offer. Lowering her eyes to the floor and smiling slightly, she asked, "On a vacation night? That would be a real inconvenience." Nate shrugged and replied solemnly, "Never mind. No one should be stranded on Christmas Eve." He opened the truck door and invited Eleanor in with a gentle wave. Eleanor hesitantly climbed into the truck. As Nate took the wheel and started the engine, Eleanor's eyes involuntarily scrutinized Nate. His auburn hair and strong jaw stood out even in the dark. His demeanor had a naturalness that was both reassuring and intimate. Eleanor took a deep breath and looked out the window at the snowy landscape, trying to suppress the emotions that were running through her. When they arrived at the garage, Nate turned on the electric stove to warm things up and turned to Eleanor before grabbing his toolbox and heading outside. "You're welcome to sit here. I'll try to be back soon." As Nate's footsteps retreated beneath the snow, Eleanor surveyed the workshop. There were rows of repair supplies lining the shelves, old posters hanging on the walls, and a few photographs. In one frame, Eleanor noticed a photo of Nate with his mother. She was hugging him with a warm smile. In another frame next to it was a picture of Nate laughing with some of his friends. Eleanor realized the excitement in her as she looked at them. Nate was not only a skilled mechanic, but also a man who was committed to his family and his community. How real he is, Eleanor thought. Lost in her thoughts, the warmth of the stove was like a blanket to wrap around her on a cold night. Outside, Nate was inwardly challenging himself as he studied the luxury car. This kind of vehicle had been one of his greatest passions in his youth. Rubbing his hands together, he set to work, his cold breath billowing into the air like smoke. Despite his chill, he felt a slight sense of satisfaction as he repaired the engine. When the engine finally came to life again, he got into his truck with a smile on his face and returned to Eleanor. Eleanor, exhausted from the warm stove, fell asleep with her head resting on the seat. Nate opened the truck door quietly and stood for a moment. His eyes traveled over Eleanor's chestnut hair and her cheeks, red from the cold. In that moment, this elegant woman looked as flawless as a painting. Nate shook his head from side to side, ashamed of his own thoughts. He leaned in slowly and called out in a soft whisper, "Eleanor?" Eleanor woke with a start and immediately straightened up. She smiled slightly as her eyes met Nate's, embarrassed. "Oh, I'm sorry. It's been such a hard day, I didn't realize." Nate interrupted him by raising his hand. "It's okay. We all have days like this." For a moment they were locked together. Nate's warm brown eyes gave Eleanor more confidence and peace than she had expected. In that moment, even though they weren't talking, they were sharing something. Eleanor looked away and smiled slightly. Nate nodded and started the truck's engine. Close encounters on the road as they drove down the snowy road. Nate broke the silence. "Eleanor, it's not wise to travel long distances in this weather. Both the car and the roads are hard on you." Eleanor laughed lightly, shaking her head. "You are right. But what can I do? I had no choice because of the news I got this morning." "What kind of news?" Nate asked, curious. Eleanor answered after a brief pause, "It's a complicated family matter." "It's always a bit complicated at Christmas time, isn't it?" Nate smiled. "You're right. But it's worth it to be with your family. It's days like this that you realize how much you depend on them." These words sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. This was a man who was not only helpful but who also knew his values. They got to know each other better, making small talk along the way. Nate's calmness and sincerity were like medicine for Eleanor's tired soul. When Nate dropped Eleanor off safely at the chalet, Eleanor thanked him and began rummaging through her bag. "I have to pay you, I went to all this trouble." Nate shook his head as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his card. "My pleasure. If you ever have a similar situation, call me." Eleanor looked into Nate's eyes as she took the card. His gaze, deep and meaningful, hung in the air for a moment. He smiled slightly and said, "Thank you. Good night, Nate." When Eleanor came in, Nate stood in his truck for a moment, watching her silhouette disappear into the snow. Was tonight just a coincidence, or was it the beginning? Even as Nate returned to his family and chatted with his mother over a warm dinner, he couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor. Eleanor, on the other hand, remembered Nate as she sipped her coffee in front of the fireplace in the chalet. This cold night of the new year was perhaps the beginning of a new story for both of them. The vacation was over and the city was starting to bustle again. But for Eleanor it was a different story. Her mind was still full of Nate. She couldn't stop thinking about him, and with each passing day, Nate's sincere gaze and gentle gestures became clearer and clearer in her mind. "I'll take the car in for service," she thought one morning. It was both a logical excuse and a solution to these feelings that were building up inside her. "Just in case," he said, and took his car to a service center in the city center. After carefully examining the car, the mechanic looked up, smiled and said, "There is nothing wrong with it. It won't leave you stranded." Whoever handled this car really knew what they were doing. Eleanor's heart sped up. Nate's skill on that cold snowy night was not just a repair skill, it was a sign of his talent and work ethic. Eleanor searched for a way to return Nate's kindness. Finally, she came up with an idea. Eleanor had a wide business network, and a close friend of hers was involved in the import and export of car parts. Eleanor met with this friend and told him what had happened. Fixing a luxury sports car on a snowy night? That's more than a mechanic. The friend said he wanted to meet Nate. Eleanor hesitantly handed her friend the card Nate had given her, but with one condition: "Please don't mention me. Let this be strictly professional." Her friend went to Nate's garage the next day. They talked about luxury cars and parts that kept breaking down. Nate sensed that something was wrong. Is this woman trying to do something to me? He thought. But the nature of the business and the earning potential intrigued him. Plus, these parts were related to cars, a passion of his since his youth. He accepted the job and left his friend with a satisfied smile on his face. But at the same time he guessed that Eleanor was behind it. That night Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about Nate. Her thoughts were so intense that she picked up her cell phone and dialed the number. Nate answered the phone in a calm voice. "Hello, Eleanor?" Eleanor tried to start a casual conversation. "Hi, how are you? I was worried about you." Nate immediately told her about his friend. "A gentleman came into my shop today. We got to talking about cars and parts, and I'm sure you know something about that." Eleanor hadn't expected him to show up so quickly. With a slight blush, she told him what had happened. Nate thanked her calmly but seriously. "Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity for me." Eleanor paced nervously back and forth in the large hall of the repair shop. Before she could collect her thoughts, an invitation rolled off her tongue. "Well, if you're free, would you like to come for coffee?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the phone. Nate didn't know what to say for a moment. But he couldn't refuse the offer. "Sure," he said, and then added to wrap up the conversation, "and we can talk about work." When he hung up the phone, Nate put his forehead in the palm of his hand and mumbled to himself, laughing, "What job? Oh, my stupid head." Nate dressed carefully. He put on a clean shirt, coat and his best boots. When he arrived at the chalet he was mesmerized by the view. The house, warm and cozy with its wooden details, stood in the middle of a snow-covered nature. The view was spectacular, the mountains rising behind the house and the forest stretching in front of it, offering a peace hidden in silence. Nate paused for a moment and sighed before knocking on the door. Eleanor opened the door. With a slight smile, she welcomed Nate in and took his coat. "It's a beautiful house," Nate said as he moved toward the warmth of the fireplace. A sad smile appeared on Eleanor's face. "I inherited it from my mom. I've been alone here since she died and I have everything but..." Eleanor paused for a moment, her eyes on the floor. "Yet I feel alone." Nate heard the break in Eleanor's voice. He realized that behind her seemingly strong stance she was hiding a great loneliness. His eyes drifted to the photographs on the wall. A young Eleanor and her mother sharing a happy moment. The images gave Nate a warmth and a sadness at the same time. He spoke slowly. "Loneliness sometimes weighs heavier than anything else. But to be able to bear it. It shows that you are a very strong person." Eleanor sipped her coffee, her eyes fixed on Nate. Her thoughts were a mess, swirling with the emotions of sharing such a quiet, intimate moment with him. When Nate finished his cup, Eleanor got up to pour him another. As she reached for the mug, her hand accidentally brushed against his. For a second both of them froze. Eleanor felt a wave of warmth rush through her, her heart pounding in her chest. Nate, on the other hand, turned slightly red and quickly looked down at his lap. Feeling flustered, Eleanor stumbled her way to the kitchen to make more coffee. When she came back, Nate took a deep breath as if he was about to say something he'd been holding in for a long time. "This isn't easy for me to say, but thank you for taking the first step. I don't think I could have done it. Ever since I met you, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. But I can't just be your friend. If this makes you uncomfortable, please just tell me and I'll leave." Eleanor was stunned. His words hit her like a wave, leaving her speechless. Her eyes filled with tears, her heart racing uncontrollably. She didn't know what to say. So instead she leaned in and kissed him. Nate didn't pull away. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her and held her tightly. The crackling of the fireplace filled the silence as the snow continued to fall outside, painting a breathtaking scene. They stayed like that for what felt like forever, holding on to each other, letting the moment sink in. It was clear to both of them, this wasn't just a fleeting connection. It was something deep, something real. Eleanor felt like she was finally stepping out of the loneliness that had consumed her for so long. And Nate? He felt like he had found the missing piece of his soul. Under the falling snow of a new year, their love was just beginning to bloom. Love this story? Don't forget to tap that like button and subscribe to Emotional Lines for more heartfelt tales. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us how this story made you feel with just one word in the comments.